put the survey I put the survey responses in Google Slides so that they would be a little bit easier for us to follow and track. We're going to actually included in the survey is the question around multiple folks having information and whether or not there can be a decision to have one of those multiple people make the report versus having multiple people, which was part of our conversation. You may or may not remember from last time. So we're going to review the survey findings, starting with that particular question and trying to get a little bit more precise. And then we'll continue on with the other two directives that Trace talked us through. Thank you, Jordan, for sharing the PDF so that you all can see and reflect on some of the responses that we received in comment form on draft language and so forth. But I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slides. All right, can everyone see? Are we good, Jordan? Can we see? Can you all see okay, perfect. I'm going to actually put it in slideshow view so it's a little bit easier for folks. So as I noted in kind of the preview for the conversation today, the first question included the language of any person specified in subsection 2 who has reasonable cause to know or suspect that a child has been subjected to abuse or neglect, or who has observed the child being subjected to circumstances or conditions that would reasonably result in abuse or neglect shall immediately, upon receiving such information, report or cause a report to be made of such fact. And then the question was around whether the highlighted section requires amendment to address circumstances involving 2 or more mandatory reporters. Overwhelmingly, and reporters obviously is cut off here, but overwhelmingly of the 13 survey respondents that completed the survey as of the time that Jordan pulled this data, almost 70% said yes. So yes to amend the section. 30.8 said no, so almost 31% no. So I wanna open the floor. Again, you have reference to the full survey findings, which includes some of the comments. Feel free to reference that for the purpose of the conversation, but want to tease out a little bit from those of you who had some thoughts on changes to the language. Zane, I see your box and I know that you had some comments. Would open the floor on any additional commentary, thoughts you have regarding the changes that should be included in this particular code site.
So for me, there were two things that were happening, I think, that I wanted to clarify. And I don't recall exactly how I answered this particular question on the survey. I don't know if that's in the Google Drive or not. But and Jordan, you said you had those responses, the responses.
Zane, I can look up for you really quick how you responded.
But I think where I'm concerned is distinguishing the difference between multiple mandatory reporters that directly observe the same situation versus delegating the authority to someone else to be that mandatory reporter. And I felt like this was starting to get muddled. Like I in my mind, I see it as two different issues, but it almost felt like we were trying to make it the same issue. And maybe I'm off track with my comments or my observation of how that was kind of forming. But I think in my comments, I just wanted to be sure when we were addressing specifically 2 or more mandatory reporters that I don't want to let a direct observer off the hook, particularly around investigations and court evidence and those kinds of things, to be given a free pass because of language that we kind of don't get right the first time. So those were my concerns.
Yeah, if I can just give some context really quickly on how we developed the survey, because Zane, you're exactly right. We have very specific directives that look at unique issues that, while they do very much overlap, for us to respond to those directives in turn we wanted to isolate them as best we could so we could get down to that very essence of the directive. So as we went through the survey, you should have noticed that we were trying to specify, and I appreciate that they overlap, and that's part of the conversation we're having today, but we were really trying to get to directive. So when we asked about delegation, we asked a question that was, please consider this an isolation of institutional reporting. And then we asked institutional reporting questions. So to the best that we could, because these issues are so tightly interwoven, I understand that they're really hard to break apart. We did our best to form the survey in a way that would allow us to isolate concepts and then build on those concepts as we dove deeper and deeper into the directive. So if it feels like we're chunking it out in the survey, we were intentionally doing that because that's just the best way for us to form that baseline for that recommendation.
Thank you for that context, Jordan. Zane?
So I guess my mind is still lingering on, does the highlighted text require amendment to address the circumstances involving two or more mandatory reporters? So again, I don't know if I said yes or no to the overall question, whether I just put it in my comments, but again, I guess I probably put no because I still believe that every direct observer should have to report or make their own report.
Yeah, you did respond to yes to this question, Zane, and I have, let me stop sharing real quick. I have the comments that you included, and I can say thematically, of the comments that were provided to this response, most had something around the theme of ensuring that a single reporter could make the report if both individuals had the exact same information, or if the person making the report had the most information, so the most comprehensive or substantial information about the event or event circumstances, so that it wasn't the person with the least amount of information. So those were some of the themes that came out in the comments that folks included in the survey around getting some more clarity and precision around if a single person can make a report where multiple folks have essentially the same information. Those were some of the clarifying themes. And Zane, in your comment specifically, you said, I don't know the highlights. I don't know that the highlighted section needs change. I think a clarifying sentence after it should be added regarding two or more mandatory reporters that have the same information can jointly file a report, or something along the lines of relying on one reporter to file the report as long as non-reporting parties retain documentation that the report was adequately filed. So if that jogs your memory.
I've slept a couple of nights since I filled out this.
No, I get it. I can't remember what happened yesterday.
But yeah, I mean, I think that still sums up my thoughts around this. Is I just want things to be clarified and not muddled for our mandatory reporters. I just would, I just like crystal clear language, as crystal clear as we could possibly make something that's so complicated. But again, I just, I don't want to see us create a loophole unintentionally in the law that could affect, the safety of a child. But I think most mandatory reporters have the best intentions in mind. I just want a mechanism, because we've talked a lot in this task force about, okay, but is DHS then required to give a case number or something that the mandatory reporter can fall back on in the event that because again, if I'm with my staff and I'm going to say to my program director, okay, you make this report, we both saw the same thing, I still need to be protected as a mandatory reporter. So I think my comments kind of fall in line with the fact that I think there needs to be some reciprocity built into the system that kind of makes DHS, provide something to the caller. So at least in documentation and case files, we have a mechanism that says, oh no, we were familiar. My name is on this report. Here's the case ID. I don't know that every county is doing that, but of course, and maybe Michelle can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know that every county is providing something back to a caller as far as any kind of reference number or proof, so to speak, that a report was filed.
Thank you, Zane. Jessica and Kevin, I know that you had your hand up, or okay, you're good. Okay. Jessica?
Thanks. Sorry, I was on vacation, so I just filled these out this morning. So my memory is only like this much better actually with what I said. I thought, this could use clarification on, in really what we could do is we could make a suggestion just to remove the language or cause to be made, right? That seems to be the only language that suggests that someone else besides the person with the information would report it. So if we just say, shall report, and I know we're working on immediately language, so shall report immediately or within 24 hours, whatever language we land on that piece, and just remove the or cause to be made language. And I mean, I'm really just going straight into like drafting mode with that. But to me, that says, okay, it's very clear the reporter has the duty. And then I know that other pieces are kind of woven into that.
So you answered no to that question of whether, well, no, never mind.
Sorry, I said yes, we should amend it and we should just remove the language that says or cause to be made and just leave it at report.
Yeah, so then
every person
who has knowledge has a responsibility or duty to make the report.
I think that then we could, I do think that we could add an additional sentence if we wanted to say, we make a recommendation that language should be crafted in another sentence. It could say, shall report, period, if two or more people have the same information, then one could report. But honestly, I know we've been wanting to find a solution to that. I do think that makes it messy. I'd rather just have two people calling in, but I know that that's me.
Thank you, Jessica. Jennifer? Oh, Michelle. I'm sorry. Oh. Hold on. Michelle, your hand is blending in, so I didn't notice it. We're gonna go to Michelle and then to Jennifer.
Thanks. Sorry. I think my bigger concern is when people have different information and about making a report and making sure that they have similar information, which to me means they're together on the scene or in the classroom or in the emergency room, and they all have the same information to report versus a teacher who gets it and then sends a child to a school nurse, and then the child is asked to repeat or disclose further or get additional information. So I don't know if there can be a delineation there, but I also think it's really taxing on the system for multiple people to call in and have to generate separate reports. And the way that Trails, the statewide database, is structured is it doesn't allow for the documentation of more than one mandated reporter. There's only a space to put one name and one set of information. And so I just wonder if, again, I think this is a big can of worms to open, but Trails could be modified to add that there would be more than one reporting party available. And let's say that Jennifer has the information and Kevin has the information. Could Kevin, if Jennifer makes the initial report and Kevin's aware, and we say that every person with knowledge has to call, could Kevin call and say, I want to add to this report and have my name documented? And Zane, I don't think consistently across the 64 counties that you are given the referral ID number. That is I would say in Arapahoe is your password to then say, here's the referral ID number for your documentation that a report was made. It's also then opens the ability for you to call back with that referral number that's only attached to you so that someone couldn't pretend to be you thinking that they made the report, trying to verify that it was you, right? That we would give you specifically that number. So, but I don't think that that's consistent practice across all 64 counties.
Thank you, Michelle. We're actually going to tease some of that procedural part, the process piece out with question 3. So stay tuned for more conversation. I know that these sort of questions bleed into each other a little bit. But there is a separate question that looks at specifically at the process for responding or for documentation. Jennifer?
The more people that talk, the more my mind is working on all of this. But the thing I was thinking about was Jessica's comment about taking out the cause to be made, because I think that's exactly what we're talking about in some of these next questions, like you just said, that if we reach a conclusion that one person, the person with the most direct knowledge, however we decide to address that, can make the report and give that reference number. And the reference number piece, I've always gotten one, but I understand that county by county that might not be the case. But to be able to share that with the other reporters who have the same information. But I also agree with Michelle. I think we have to have the ability to have more than one person make a report. I don't want to see us say you can't. Only one person can make a report. But we can say your duty is completed if you get the reference number and you have the same information as someone else. So I think we want to be careful about, there's still going to be people who are not going to be comfortable with this and are going to want to make their own report and cover their own asses.
Thank you, Jennifer. Any other thoughts, reflections? Jessica, I see you just put a note in the chat around training for DHS intake and 911 to ask who else has information. That could be a training recommendation, does not really belong in statute as it's procedural, but also need to remember that 911 dispatchers and non-emergency police lines have different systems and also take these calls. Good point, Jessica. Any additional comments, thoughts, reflections on changing the statute in reference to the shall make or shall cause to be made? All right, we're going to move on to the second survey question, which is reflected here. Should there be a required procedure for providing mandatory reporters who report information previously provided to human services? And these questions cut off, so let me look at what the full question is. My apologies. And I may put it in the chat. Should there be a required procedure for providing mandatory reporters who report information previously provided to human services or law enforcement with verification of the previous report and a reference number? Jennifer, you were just speaking to that. I'm actually going to put the question in. Oh, thank you, Jordan. I didn't see you. I didn't see you putting that in the chat. We had an overwhelming yes to that survey question, with 69 just 0.2%, just under 70% saying yes, 30.8% saying no. So essentially the same number or share of respondents to yes and no as for question one. There were 13 responses at the time that the survey findings were pulled last night. And again, we know that I think 3 additional folks filled out the survey since then. So would love to hear from folks any thoughts, reflections they have on their response to this question. Kevin, I see your hand is up, and then we'll go to you next, Jessica.
Yeah, I think I can't remember. I think I voted no on this one, only because I'm not sure what benefit it is to me as the reporter to get the knowledge that a prior report had been made, other than for my own record keeping, maybe, but it doesn't prevent me from having to make a call. And it also, I think, and maybe Jessica would chime in on this too, but places burden on law enforcement and DHS to then have to look through their records and to coordinate with each other. And in my experience, law enforcement is varied across counties, whether it's police and sheriffs, and whether they share information or not with each other, and how they would all be able to work together to find out what the prior reference number was. But then if I'm the reporter, once I get the reference number from there having been a report made in the past, what do I do with it? How does that help me? And how does that help protect the child, I guess.
Thank you, Kevin. And this, I feel like some of the I don't know if some of the folks who may have responded yes might have meant no, or there might have been some nuance in their response. In the conversations that we've had, including some of the conversation today, that reference number seemed to be most important for the folks who may not have like who initially made the report, or the person who may not have made the report, recognizing that a report was actually made. And I don't know if maybe I'm confusing things. So I'll just pass the baton to Jessica.
Doris, that is correct though. Just this question was formed in response to, we had a conversation around, okay, like this was two people, we both have the same knowledge. I'm calling in, I'm being told that this is the same thing. And then we talked about, for that reporter who then doesn't make the report because it's already been identified, then gets that reference number, both for their own proof that they've made the report.
Yeah.
That they can circle back and check in, just as some context.
Okay.
Here.
Thank you, Jordan. Jessica?
Yeah, this is one where I agree with Kevin. I put no, there should not be like a requirement. And again, kind of going bigger picture here, when I hear requirement in the question, I think, are we making a recommendation to make the statute address this? And I think no, it's a procedural issue. Different counties are going to deal with it differently. And granted, every county I've worked in or requested DHS reports from, they come with a reference type. They come with like a case number, and same with like 911 and what we call CAD reports, or incident detail reports, which I bet Carlos can speak to a little bit more on the process in which they do record keeping for those. But like thinking of it as an attorney, you can call in and request those things. If the reporter wants to call in and get verification that their report was made, they can do that. There is that special part of the confidentiality statute that allows for a reporter to get information about that. So they could, I think, already request that if that is something they wanted. I think across the board, when we're talking about, does this help increase child safety? Does it help lower, the disproportionality of certain communities being brought into the system? Does it really aid mandatory reporters? To me, it falls pretty low on the value scale for the requirement that it would put out on every county and all the resources that it would require to implement it. I do think, yeah, the kind of, we have gotten deep into our groups and hypotheticals about, well, hypothetically, the second person who has the information could want to make sure they don't have to report, so they call in and get the number. I mean, essentially, they're calling in and reporting. Like, that's what's happening. But I think that it's highly unlikely that occurs so often. And certainly, I guess I'm thinking back to the cases that I pulled and read through all of the failure to report facts. And I'm thinking, I cannot think of one case where anybody was charged or considered for failure to report because they were an additional person who knew that another person had reported. You know what I'm saying? So I think in practice, like, yeah, we in our lofty task force world can come up with all the hypotheticals. And of course, as a lawyer, that's what I love doing. But I do think we'd be a little bit in the weeds by trying to require a procedure for documenting a referral number and all of that. These systems mostly have that in place already, and there's ways to go about getting it.
Thank you, Jessica. Jennifer and then Zane.
So I thought the question was pretty confusing. So it seemed like it could have been read two different ways. That maybe I, as a mandatory reporter, completely separate and apart from someone else who had already made a report, could call DHS and get a reference number. And I don't think they can give you that. I think that's a confidentiality issue. So that is unclear in the question itself to me. As far as the way that this kind of reflects back to our first question, though, I think there does need to be, and Jessica may be right that it doesn't belong in statute, but there does need to be some piece of information that the person actually making the report gets that the other mandatory reporters can be given so that they have fulfilled their duty. And I just think, regardless of whether anyone's been prosecuted or any of that, like, I have always operated in spaces where there are mandatory reporters, and the default has always been everybody reports, you report everything, and let DHS or law enforcement figure it out. So I think we're trying to make that less of a burden on mandatory reporters, and this might contribute to that.
Thank you. I mean, I think we're trying to make that less of a burden, and I think that there is a desire to shift from this mindset of everybody report all the things, because we know that that practice is discriminatory. Zane?
So I see this a little differently, and I want to also say that I first of all disagree. If all 64 counties are using trails, so there is a reference number automatically generated when they input something into the computer. That's not a resource issue. That's not a process issue. I think that's something that mandatory reporters can get back in return. The other thing is that the majority of complaints I hear from mandatory reporters is they don't feel like the department did anything, or that they reported and made multiple reports and they couldn't get the department to do anything. And this happens particularly in these rural counties. And it's really frustrating for mandatory reporters to constantly be making reports and have no recourse. So when I call Stephanie and I say, hey, Stephanie, this is my fifth, freaking report, and here's my reference numbers. You need to start looking into this. I think there's some accountability on the county side that needs to be recognized in this process as well, because we have counties that are not responding. And when I was a caseworker, I watched supervisors toss reports in the trash. And so there was no accountability. I mean, they were fired, but one of them still in our local department she changes reporting information regularly. We have filed, I don't know how many complaints against this employee over the years because she changes reporting information to keep the county from having to go out and respond. So I would say that that this piece is not only for mandatory reporters. I think it's a piece of what we need as far as accountability within the Department of Human Services structure. So mandatory reporters aren't just making futile reports, and that they feel like, I mean, getting a number back to me gives me some confidence that at least there's some tracking. And I don't think any county should get off the hook, or that we should take it as a resource issue or feel I mean, that's why they exist. So if I'm doing my job as a mandatory reporter, I really want to hear back from the department that there's something that's been done, that there's a tracking number, that at least I am covering myself in that process. So that's why I feel so strongly about this, is because, when we're in these smaller counties where decisions and cultures are just different, this is what's happening.
Thank you, Zane. Gina, I saw that you put a comment in the chat agreeing with Zane. Anything else you want to add? I'd love to bring your voice into the conversation.
I just again am just saying that I really need to see that, not only that reciprocity, but also consistency. Like, I live in a very rural county as well, and that does not let us off the hook in terms of, how things go in the big city, whatever. That also, our systems are not, because of how small or rural or whatever resource poor that we are, does not in any way let anyone off the hook in terms of keeping kiddos safe. And that if there's a process in place that is potentially burdensome to, to our systems, that I agree. That's what you all are there for, and it is burdensome, because it should be, because this is a critical issue. This is very, these can result in fatal outcomes. And so also, we're not utilizing what the systems could be doing to prompt, in my opinion, community responses to these concerns, where we're talking about that too, the alternative methods to addressing families and folks who are in who are in crisis and things like that. Like, what do we have these community programs for too then? Like, if they're not working together, they're not talking to each other, everybody's just minding their own business. In my opinion, that's how abuse goes unreported. That's how children continue to live in unsafe situations. Folks know all around them and nothing is going on. And we have all of these community programs who say they're addressing parts of these concerns and they're not being prompted to work together. Now, that's on each community to get that ball rolling. But where there's that reciprocity, I feel like it can start those steps in, well, here's this information we've given you back. Now what are we going to do with it as a community? Because I believe that these are responses to abuse is also a community issue as well. We cannot stop these cycles of abuse if we just rely on our systems to be the hammer in the situation. We have within our communities the understanding, the knowledge, and the connection to address these things. But I feel that we need to put in place that consistency. It needs to be the same across the board, because that's what we keep hearing from our mandatory reporters, from our community members who feel that they're, am I 24/7? Am I not? Sort of thing. I just feel like there's just too much inconsistency to, in my opinion, play around with it. I just really want us to get, again, clarification, get some clear cut understanding of how this is going to work, and really, again, just wanted to highlight that reciprocity piece. Like, we should be working together, talking to each other. We should be applying those, that expertise within our communities to support families and to make sure that our kiddos are safe. But also, like we said, we spent a lot of time talking about, what about these alternatives? What about, getting folks to, to supportive resources? They're in our community. We have those, and where we say yes, each county does their own thing differently. Yes, they apply their care differently, but it shouldn't be that they get to interpret the law differently. That's where I was getting.
Thank you, Gina. I want to bring us back to, like, the question that we're talking about is really focused on when you have multiple reporters that have information on an incident or events involving a child that might constitute child abuse or neglect. Should there be, for this particular question, should there be some kind of information given back to a reporter when a report has already been filed for this incident on this child? And so I just want to make sure that we're really focused on when multiple people have bits and pieces or the same information on a child that involves potentially child abuse or neglect. What is the duty and what might be the obligations that of the state or the child welfare agency or law enforcement to provide back to a mandatory reporter in that instance where you have multiple folks who have the same information or similar information. Michelle and then Stephanie.
Just three things I want to share. Just so you know, the statewide hotline, when it was implemented in 2015, was designed to mitigate the concerns that Zane reported, right? Where everything was taken by hand, nothing was recorded. So the statewide hotline is, and any county hotline are all recorded from the time the phone rings until the time the phone hangs up, which should mitigate the issue of people changing information and or not. It requires you to link it then to a referral with the information that always stays together for the life of the report. The other piece is that the child welfare system currently interprets the statute to believe that we cannot confirm or deny that a report has been made. So if Kathy calls and says, I want to know if a referral was made, I think another doctor already called, I can't confirm or deny that. It requires me to take a separate report linked to her recording, which is another 30, 40-minute process to go through, which is sometimes duplicative and unnecessary when it is exactly the same information. We use the loophole or interpret this loophole of shall cause a report to be made to say, if she can get somebody else to make the report, she's off the hook as long as she can verify that a report was made. So if we're talking about cleaning that piece of the statute up that says that more than one person has to call, I don't believe that we should allow everybody off the hook not to call. I'm simply saying, let us attach everything together in one referral by adding additional information, doing an addendum, adding additional reporting party information, and linking it to the same referral ID number. The third point that I would want to point out to you all is that we count a family's history against them by the number of referrals that are made. So if all 10 of you make a report on the same family with the same information, that number tallies in their risk assessment for the total number of referrals made against a family. And so we're also wanting to think about disproportionality, and we don't want to penalize families because all of you have the same information and are all called to make a report. I'm simply saying, I don't think that we, again, want to minimize or disregard or not have people make a report. I'm simply saying that we modify trails to allow for the ability to add to it. And there could be some potential statute cleanup because I can't already tell Kathy that a referral was made. So therefore I can't link her to a prior referral, otherwise I'd be releasing that information. So there would have to be, to me, some sort of a modification around the confidentiality laws.
Thank you for that additional context, Michelle. And a lot of, I think what you're saying that poses challenges doesn't require law change. It really requires some process change, save the part where there would need to be some changes to confidentiality to be able to provide a mandatory reporter with some information back regarding a report that may have already been made on the exact same circumstance. Thank you for that. Stephanie and then Jessica.
Yeah, I think Michelle just took all of my thoughts. I think it's as simple. I always hesitate saying that. Of having a space where we can list everybody or anyone who has been a witness to any of this and giving folks a referral number. I agree with Zane. The referral numbers are being generated. I mean, this is, we're past that. And I actually was part of setting up the 2013 statewide hotline. And so all the features that Michelle talks about are not only accurate, but they were there for these exact same reasons that we had, God, however many years ago that was. So it feels like, I don't know if we're saying different things. In other words, what we're saying, the way I see it is, if there's a way to capture more information than less about a call, that helps address this multiple caller problem where we're inundating human services with potentially the same call. And as Michelle said, sort of stacking up a family's history. Whereas if you could call and say, yeah, everybody on this screen saw it, I'm phoning it in, but here's all the other 6 people, here's the reference number. To me, that does address this issue of duplicative calls. It also potentially deals with disproportionality in the long run, not the short run. And it gives providers here protection that if they ever have to, a district attorney calls them and says, hey, we don't think you're doing your job, Dr. Wells. She can be like, I've got the reference numbers because my friend Stephanie called it in. Right. So I guess I'm just not understanding sort of the nuance, if you will. I don't understand. It feels like we're cleaning up process more than we are developing anything new.
Thank you, Stephanie. I saw some head nods, so I think there's some agreement there. Jessica?
Yeah, so okay, I had never heard that risk assessments would take multiple duplicative calls on the same incident and count those as multiple calls, and that could end up kind of, totally skewing the risk level for a family if 5 people in the school responded and found out different things about the same incident. And to me, just, looking at like, okay, process that, and I can understand why that is needed. from DHS, like from the aspect of, okay, you know, when we're doing those risk assessments, you just have to like kind of look at everything and can't necessarily then parse out, okay, this was actually 5 calls for the same incident. But that does totally change kind of my basis or my opinion on whether or not there should be language that's in statute about multiple callers. Like that's just completely unfair. That's not okay, I don't think. And I'm not like saying, oh, DHS is doing it wrong or anything. I can completely understand that process, but I don't think that anybody would want that to be the case when it's based on the same incident. It's multiple calls from the same incident. So I guess I just want to say that I did not have that in my mind when I was talking about how I didn't really see how this was affecting, this directly was having a cause and effect on disproportionate impacts. And so to me, that's a little bit more of a game changer, but I still kind of agree with like what Stephanie was saying. I think we all are saying kind of the same thing, right? This is a referral number should be had. There should be a process for DHS to take and law enforcement to say, 911 callers to say, does anybody else have this information? I'm just not sure how to fix it, considering what Stephanie is saying is kind of like there's already all of this in place, at least for DHS for it. So I guess, I don't know, that's not very helpful, but I wanted to say it.
And I think Michelle in the chat noted that the protocol does include a question around who else may have knowledge of the events or incidents. So I think that there is that information does get captured, but not in a way that necessarily then absolves mandatory reporters. So because it's part of the information gathering on, you know, who else can we talk to better understand the events or incidents. Michelle, I don't want to put any words in your mouth. But that's the way that I read that. But again, I think when you look at on the other side, it doesn't get to some of the nuance that Michelle shared about the risk assessment includes all of the prior reports that were made on this particular family. And that includes those reports that might have come in from different reporters on the exact same incident that, you know, I think, Jessica, to your point, you know, I think, you know, may cause us to revisit some of the way that we were thinking about this particular piece. Michelle, you came off mute.
Yeah, I mean, so there's an enhanced screening guide that counties are required to use that has a series of questions. And in that tool that they're required to use, they are required to ask about who else knows about the abuse or neglect. I want to offer one point of clarification. When I'm talking about the risk assessment, the score is modified to make the risk higher if there's an actual assessment versus referral. So let me just correct the statement. So I don't want it to make it sound like every referral. I did make it sound, and I just want to clarify that. It counts the assessments that were done. So actual cases or, you know, investigations that were open. So I want to apologize for that. And I want to offer that clarification because I just opened the tool to look at it.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification, Michelle. So only if a worker is assigned to go out and assess the family incident, does that count? But just calling in a report does not increase the level of risk score for that particular child or family.
Correct. It says number of prior assessments, and it has you document that, and then it scores it based on, you know, none, 1, 2 or more, 4 or more, etc. And it does the same for abuse, and then it does it for neglect. So prior neglect assessments, prior abuse assessments. So
thank you. And then Brittany added a comment in the chat regarding red team review, and that there is some consideration for number of prior reports included in the assessment or analysis that's done by red teams.
Yeah, so during the red team process, we are required to document the total number of referrals, and that doesn't mean investigations, the total number of referrals, how many of them screened out, how many of them accepted, how many of them then that are founded for abuse or neglect. And remember, where Colorado is a differential response state. So even if we do an assessment, there may not be a finding. So that number is included in the decision making around, and we teach people the more referrals that there are, the more concern that there is, right? And so it still is something that we are taking into consideration and weighing out at the decision making point. And so again, I don't want to minimize that. Just because it's a screened out referral, it doesn't count in the risk assessment score, because Brittany's correct. It does weigh into the decision that we make at Red Team. And so I just think we have to think about that for the disproportionality of families.
Thank you. I think that, Zane, I'm going to come back to you because I want to, make sure that we get to the remaining questions so that Jordan can have what she needs to start crafting some refined language. And I think that all of these questions sort of bleed together. So I think the conversation will continue to flow, and we'll get a little bit more precision. So question 4 is focused on standardized practices for interagency cross-reporting when there are multiple reports that are made to law enforcement and human resources. And Jordan, if you could again.
I think we're on question 3.
You are so right.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
3. I was trying to move us ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, that was my accident. Because I never mind. Sorry, we're on question 3. Should the task force issue recommendations to create a process, which we've started talking a little bit about, for human services and law enforcement to utilize when receiving something information because it's cut off.
I threw it in the
additional. I think it was additional information.
Yeah, I was trying to think of what could that AL be. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, this was designed around what Michelle shared with the group that caught everyone's attention last time, which is sometimes you have 2 parties calling on the same incident or concern, but they contain different information. And I think we use that example of you may have a child in a school that is the subject of the report, but a teacher and a nurse or counselor may have very, very different information about the report. And we didn't want to create something that inadvertently knocked out the collection of that information. So Michelle, you may be able to articulate that better than I did, but this was an attempt to address that point.
I don't know what.
And we had a majority yes on this one. That it ticked up a little bit at just over 84%. So most of you felt like the task force should issue recommendations to create some sort of process for human services and law enforcement to use when receiving multiple calls. And again, we've talked a little bit about this already. And now handing the floor back over to you, Michelle.
I don't know that I have anything additional to offer other than what I've already said, which is really that, allowing for, and again, I'm going to use, Dr. Wells's example, if you're in an emergency room, everybody in there treating a child at Children's Hospital is mandated to report. So we're really going to have all of the doctors and the nurses and the social worker all make a report when they all have the same identical information. And so I think that's something that we need to tease out, because there are entities like the same thing would happen if you have a child abuse case and the paramedics and the firefighters and the police officers respond. They're all required to make a report, and they're all very confused about that. And they all still end up calling one on top of the other, which then requires an entire new report. And that would be my hope, is that we clean that piece up.
Thank you for that, Michelle. I think that so there are 2 components when we think about multiple reporters. There's the processes for law enforcement and human services to use when they receive reports, and they're coming in from multiple reporters who all have the same information. And there is, so that's sort of one side of the coin in thinking about which this question is actually focused on. But then there's the other part of it when you're thinking about what are the processes, expectations, protocols for those multiple mandatory reporters who know they have the same information. Right now with question 3, we're talking about the processes on the human services and law enforcement side, and whether or not there should be, and if so, what, but any recommendations around process changes for the human services law enforcement side when they receive reports that may come in from multiple sources regarding the same thing. Chris?
So the only thing that I would have to say is I understand how cumbersome it is on the system, but Michelle, you just clearly stated there's a doctor in there, there's a social worker in there, there's a nurse in there. We're all mandatory reporters, but we're all trained differently and see everything we're seeing is through a different lens based on our training. And so when you're telling me that we don't want the same report going down, my perception of what just happened in there and the emotional well-being of my client is completely different than the medical well-being that the doctor is looking at, maybe from a bruise or contusion or whatever aspect. I think that's the premise that I have with the multiple reporting problem, is that who's reporting it, whose name goes on it, again, the witness aspect. I don't need it to be more cumbersome. I just think we all have different trainings. I'm in some cases right now working with an LMFT, which is completely different training than my LCSW. So we don't see things identical in regards to how we should treat the client or the family. And I think that's the premise that we're looking at, is not one of us have the best result. We all have the best interest for that child, but not one of us is solely trained encompassingly, or the big word, because not enough coffee yet and it's Wednesday. And so, yeah, that we don't have all the information we need based on having her training or their training or my training. That would be my concern. So.
Thank you. Kevin?
I just want to put it on the record that as I was filling out the survey, I was confused by the questions. With the situation that Michelle is talking about, where there are multiple reporters in the same incident, all needing to make a report, I would support the position that they don't all need to make a report. But I don't know if that's more of a procedural thing than a legislative thing. I think I just worry about legislating some of this stuff when practitioners each have their own responsibility to document their own practice and what they do, and making it a legislative mandate feels really big. And I think if there's a way to do it through process, I'd prefer doing that.
Thank you, Kevin. And you know, so I don't think that all of the recommendations that come from the task force have to be legislative change. They can be procedural or process oriented. And it could be that, you know, there's some, you know, for some of it, there's a kind of a deeper analysis that gets done. But yeah, all of the recommendations don't have to be legislative changes. And I see nods from Stephanie and Jordan that I'm not misspeaking. Stephanie?
Yeah, I think I have a different view of DHS in this way, right? I see them as being the one who collects this initial call. I like Michelle's idea of having a specific place in trails, which lists other potential witnesses to an event. But I don't see, until Human Services says we are going to go assess something, right? Then they go out and they assess it. And then they would have the information to go assess it. I don't know, they're not assessing at the time that a call comes in. So when I think about, quote, duplicative reports, 20 people who witnessed the same incident, and that's assuming, right, they're all in the same room, literally witnessing the same incident. I don't see that Human Services has the ability, nor is that the place, to begin that assessment per se. It is the collection point, is how I see it. And then they sit down in red team or with supervisors, et cetera, and they say, okay, this is what we have. I have a list of 2 more witnesses or 10 more witnesses. It's my job now, right, to then make a decision about what to do with that information, and then we act on that. So I don't necessarily see the need to have 20 people call in the same report. Now I'm exaggerating, so I'll stop that. I don't see the need for 4 more people to call in a report. I do see the need to have their information documented, which then I have to trust my DHS agency and or my law enforcement agency to go do the work that we train them to do at the time that they have to do that act. So I think I want to be really careful about distinguishing between what is a hotline call and what goes in. But then the processes of what takes place with this, I don't want us to be fearful that if it isn't done in that moment, right, that it won't necessarily be done. So I just wanted to create that distinction in my mind. And I certainly know from my experience with both law enforcement and DHS, I think that is the role. And Michelle, if I'm wrong, I appreciate that. I'd like to know. The other thing I think that's important when we talk about legislation, and I'm not suggesting we necessarily need to legislate anything, you can frame things that allow people to still call. You don't, by saying, you know, if you have 2 or more folks, one can call, right? If you witness the same thing, you're not saying the other person can't call.
Yeah.
You're simply just saying we're going to allow for this process for efficiencies in the system. And I guarantee you, there will still be people who are like, no, I have stuff I want to say. We hear it all the time in my office. And so I just want to be careful, like when we do talk about legislation or rule or anything, unless language says you cannot or you shall not have more than one person report, you're not setting that up in a way that could harm, I think. It's the argument, and I hear all the time about mandated reporting as a whole. A lot of colleagues who differ in opinion will say, you don't need mandatory reporting laws to report child abuse. That's their biggest argument. People call the police every day and report crimes, right? You don't even need mandated reporting. You should get rid of it. Because the truth is, if people see harm, assuming they're good people, they're going to call it in. So that's only the distinctions I'm trying to make.
Thank you, Stephanie. Jennifer?
I want to disagree with the idea that this shouldn't be in legislation or shouldn't be in statute, because mandatory reporters are listed in statute and their obligation is in statute. And so we need to say in statute if someone else reporting is adequate. So I think that's just really important that it really does need to be in statute, because it isn't a DHS rule. It isn't a law enforcement policy. It is a statute, and it is, you know, I don't even remember how many different mandatory reporters are in the list, but it's long and it's varied, and it's people from all different types of professions. And then I just want to say one other thing. I appreciate Chris's point about different professionals being in the room with different perspectives, but that isn't always the case. When I think about agencies I've worked for, you know, it might be an intern and a social worker in the room, or it might be someone in training and a victim advocate in the room. And then both of those people have an obligation. And what we're trying to do is, again, I think streamline this both for the mandatory reporters and for the department or law enforcement.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think one of the question that folks seem to keep coming back to, I wanted, and Jordan, close your ears. I want to jump to that question so that we can sort of get clarity around that. And that's the question around delegation of duty, of whether or not a mandatory reporter can be allowed to delegate their individual duty to report concerns of abuse or neglect to another. And in the survey, it was an overwhelming no. 92.3% of the 13 responses said no, 7.7% said yes. And the reason why I wanted to come to this question, because when we think about multiple folks having the same kind of information, and sort of choosing to have one person report over everyone with that information reporting is a question around delegation. But the delegation question also includes those circumstances where you could have as an institutional or organizational policy that, you know, the person with the information, let's say it's a teacher, you know, then having to then give that information to like the school nurse, or send the child to the school nurse and have the nurse then report. That's another way of delegating authority. So I want to move this conversation to really get your thoughts and insights on the delegation question, because I think that that's one of the things that folks are really grappling with, even more than like the process pieces. And I put the question in the chat that was included in the survey. Again, most of you said no to that question, but wanted to kind of just tease out some of your thinking. Jennifer?
I think what I was thinking, and I was just looking at other people's comments, and it seems like most of us are on the same page about this, was delegating means giving a responsibility to someone else, a supervisor, a designated person in your agency, something like that, as opposed to one person making the report to cover the responsibility of all the other mandatory reporters in the agency, and that being, ideally, the person with the most direct information about it, the most complete information, whatever language makes the most sense there. But I really think delegating and like, can someone else make a report and that fulfill your obligation are two completely different questions.
And we did break that out as two different questions, just for helpful in context for the conversation. This first question that Doris has raised is question 5, which is solely this question of delegation, and then we'll move into 6 and 7, which have to do with that institutional policies and the provisions within those policies, if that helps, Jennifer.
No, I think the reason that the answer is no from the majority of us is that delegation is a different thing than the other conversation.
Jennifer, can you go back and just explain the difference, the two types of delegation you're referencing? I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Yeah, so I don't think of the first conversation we were having as delegation. I think of it as, can one person be designated to make the report when multiple people within the same agency have the same information? As opposed to, our policy is that I go to my supervisor, I tell the supervisor about something they did not witness and they do not otherwise have information about, and they make the report. That is delegating to me. It is giving that responsibility to someone who was not otherwise involved in the process.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I see some folks in the chat agreeing with that. That was their understanding as well. And so maybe it is, you know, when we think about statutory change, it is clarifying what it means to delegate one's individual mandatory reporting responsibility to another who doesn't have information, direct information about that incident, and clarifying the extent to which and under what circumstances individuals who all have the same knowledge because they were privy to the same information at the same time, deciding that not all of those individuals need to separately and independently make reports to the hotline. Is that the, like, as I hear the conversations, is that how folks are kind of distinguishing those scenarios?
And I'm just going to add to that, Doris, because Stephanie said this earlier, but they can if they want to.
Yeah.
If, you know, I think we need to keep coming back to that and remember that we're not telling people they can't make a separate report. And get it documented on their own, but that their obligation is fulfilled by having someone else with similar knowledge report it.
That's right. There's nothing that limits or prevents somebody from independently making a separate report, but they're not required to do so in these instances. Any other thoughts, comments, refinements to how we're thinking about sort of these related questions?
I just have one additional point, Doris. I think what I hear often from reporting parties is I have to stop at my supervisor first before I'm allowed to make a report. And then my supervisor gets to direct whether or not I make a report. Or they I don't stop it, modify it, whatever that looks like, or they say, I'm going to do it. And I see it happen in educational and childcare institutions on a regular basis. And so I think this, from my perspective, this part of the legislation must be modified, cleaned up, or whatever to provide clarity that a supervisor cannot or shall not, or that institutions shall not have the ability to inhibit someone from making a report. It cannot be delegated, any of those things. And so, and I hear, like I've heard from schools frequently in the last 3 decades about, I don't want my paraprofessional making a report because they don't know the family like I do. I have other information. I want to stunt their ability to make a report. I think absolutely that from my perspective, I'm very passionate about making sure that this gets addressed in the legislation.
Thank you, Michelle. Michelle M. and Gina, I see your hands up. We'll call on you in just a second. I put in the chat question 6, I think to your point, Michelle, this question that gets to institutions developing internal policies or practices regarding mandatory reporters making reports to suspected abuse or neglect. I think that probably includes, and Jordan, I don't know if you intended it to include, but the processes that say that, you know, this person is designated as the person who makes the report for that institution. Am I misreading that?
No, this was just kind of the big broad question of yes or no, should institutions be allowed to have internal policies? That was this question 6. Question 7, just to give everyone context as we build, there was a question of size on those institutions, which we can come back to later, but I already posted question 8, which hits on what you just said, Doris. Can a supervisor stop or can a supervisor inhibit that report? So we kind of asked them in 2 different phases because we were trying to understand yes or no to institutional internal policies generally. And then if those policies are allowed, how much can they inhibit that person with the firsthand knowledge from making a report? Does that help?
Yeah. So in question 6 is just a broader question around internal policies, doesn't get specific on what those policies should or should not include. And question 8 gets more to Michelle's point directly around those policies that may actually prevent the person who heard that information more directly from making the report by insisting that another person in that institution is designated to make the reports.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. Thank you for that. So this question around developing internal policies, the majority of respondents said yes at just under 77%, with 23.1 saying no about just developing internal policies. And then overwhelmingly, looking at what Jordan put in the chat, most of you said no, those policies cannot include restricting the person who has the information from making the report themselves. Gina and then Kevin.
I just want to say this and then definitely help me understand better. But I'm still kind of just stuck on this like shared knowledge or shared we all are aware of the same incident. We all saw the same thing. My question is around the whole like, let's decide, only one of us is going to make the report. Um, and maybe I'm getting too much into it, but I'm just wondering like, maybe everybody is aware of the same situation or whatever. Um, but I'm just wondering if 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 two or more people, whatever, if they're talking to each other about, this is what we saw, right? This is concerning, right? You saw this particular injury, right? You saw da 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 da. Um, is that is that how are we sure that that's something that truly was witnessed by all, in terms of like, well, let's make this one report because we all saw the same thing. Did you all see the same thing, or were you all working together to support what one person's concerns were? Or maybe we all didn't see this particular bruise, but we all saw the situation, but one of us saw the bruise and we're like trying to confirm the situation. Anyways, I think I'm just getting too much into the weeds of it, but I'm just a little concerned about, we all have joint knowledge. How do we know that? How are we sure that, are we just entrusting? Is that what we're saying? Is we're just trusting that we understand what joint knowledge is? We're just trusting that there is no bias in this situation, and that potentially, and where I'm getting at is like in our smaller communities, what if these folks like have a problem with this particular family? How do we mitigate that situation? And now they're all ganging up saying, yes, we all have joint knowledge. And maybe that's just not our role, I guess, of what we're doing here. And I can appreciate that. I'm stuck on it because I'm concerned that reporters are able to find support with one another, and like confirming this is what I saw, this is what's going on, and that the family in question are at a disadvantage in that it's not just this reporter, but like there's a whole crew of them, and they decided this is the one who's going to say they saw what. And anyway, maybe it's just too far into it for me, but it's just kind of sitting in my crawl, so as they say. But I'm gonna continue to sit through this and listen in some more. It's just a little interesting to me and slash concerning.
Thank you for that, Gina. I mean, I think the concern of like, if you have a group of folks that are all talking about the incident, the ability of them to influence each other and what they thought they, saw or heard, and sort of like come up with a single story that each of them
Yeah,
individual might not have arrived at on their own, I think is a legitimate
right.
concern to raise. So this idea of co-signing, and then again, influencing the perspectives
Yeah,
of each other so that there's a single story that may or may not be accurate. And sort of like having that weaponized against some
yes,
families. Thank you.
yes. Thank you.
Kevin and then Michelle Murphy.
Sorry for continuing to reiterate my confusion with all of the questions, but I feel like I have to say it every time now. The question 6 about should they be permitted to develop internal policies to assist mandatory reporters. I was concerned with that being in the positive direction, like pushing people to make reports. I'm for not inhibiting reports to be made. I'm not necessarily in support of greasing the wheels so that more reports are made. And I want to be really clear about that. And yes, I think institutions should be able to implement policies within themselves about mandatory reporting, but I don't want them to be the tool or um, the mechanism by which they're greasing the wheels for more reports. Because I think that people already don't trust doctors, people already don't trust schools in certain communities too, in particular. And I don't want it to inhibit people going to get medical care or any of that. So that's, I guess, my position.
Thank you, Kevin. So not wanting that to like sort of widen the door for folks to just eat much more easily, just make a bunch of reports and, you know, likely exacerbate disproportionality. Michelle and then Stephanie.
So I'm vacillating between confused and concerned about what we're actually talking about and what the purpose would be of either assisting or collaborating these reports. Are we trying to mitigate bias? Are we trying to ensure the reports are made? I fully support language that says a supervisor can never prohibit a report, and I'm surprised, honestly, to hear that schools are doing that still. And I just wonder, what are we trying to get at here? Remembering, like, requiring somebody to go to a school nurse to make a report. We don't have school nurses. Even our big districts don't have school nurses every day in their buildings. Like, we need to allow for a lot of flexibility. The language in the chat from Jessica, I think, is permissive. We have to make sure any internal policies are permissive, and that the law, when there was some drafting in statute that ultimately ended up creating this task force, the language around this process was so confusing. So I don't know, whatever this group can do to get very clear about the purpose of allowing these reports, and if there are best practices for doing that, but also being permissive and ensuring that there is no delegation, feels really important to ensure the integrity of whatever comes out of this recommendation.
Thank you, Michelle. Stephanie?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about institutional policies, we obviously have to give guidance to institutions, right, about what that can or cannot be. I also think that we have to look at the real time constraints. I have heard from many mandated reporters. Let's take teachers, right? They're like, I teach 6 hours a day. I teach classes back to back. And then I end up having to make a mandatory report at 6 o'clock at night, right? Because it takes time to sit down and pick up the phone and make a call. And I've heard the same thing about nurses. I've heard the same thing about social workers. And so I don't think we can ignore the notion of providing employers, not encouraging them to report, but to provide employees with some space to do it. It isn't realistic not to do that. And I do think that's when I have seen people get in trouble, right? That's when reports get really delayed because it's 5, 7, 10 days down the road. And if this task force at some point, right, however they define immediately making a report, if that's going to be an even 24 hours, 48 or 72, I don't see how you don't make space at some level for the real obligations that are involved here. This is not a 3-minute process. And I mean, I would say on average, you know, when we make this, it's 35 minutes, maybe 40. And when you're in an industry where you're literally serving others, which these industries are, I just don't see how you cannot provide them with some space to do that. And I think that's very different than, quote, encouraging folks. And I also just wanted to touch base on, Ashley made, I think, a really important comment regarding the notion of, you know, sort of ganging up, right, creating a single story to report to DHS. I actually think the process that potentially is being suggested by this group is actually you'd have one report going in instead of 10, right? And again, if you list who those sources of information are as a standard practice, again, I come back to I have to trust my DHS colleagues or my law enforcement colleagues to do their jobs. I just have to. I mean, you know, I think that there has to be a level of trust, which I appreciate many here don't feel. And I trust me, I've had experiences that weren't great. But at the end, we have to remember, what is a mandatory reporter's job? It is to report. I think we have to be okay with that.
Thank you, Stephanie. I want to get to, in the little bit of time that we have left, this question 9 that focuses on back to internal policies within an organization or institution. I'm skipping over the question around whether there was a question on whether there should be like a size determination for an organizational size factor that gets considered in terms of whether that organization can establish internal procedures or policies. There was the responses from the survey was overwhelmingly no. And in the comments, there was some desire to include a little bit more precision around considerations, such like, or for example, if you're a smaller organization, but everybody or most of the folks in that organization are mandatory reporters, then the organization's size doesn't matter so much as like the role and expectations for the staff. But again, most of you indicated that you didn't want size to be the determiner. You really wanted to focus more on role and responsibility and allowing for those smaller organizations, because of the staff that they have, to be able to develop some internal policies. It sounds like generally speaking, the idea of organizations having the ability to establish internal protocols that don't limit individuals in that organization from individually reporting if they want to do so, that message came across really clear. So I'm going to skip to question 9 around, again, coming back to internal policies and the extent to which an individual, if internal policies are permitted, should they allow a mandatory reporter who has reasonable cause to know or suspect abuse or neglect to delegate their duty to report if they alert their supervisor administrator of their concern. So in this instance, the mandatory reporter has some direct information. They want to have the ability to delegate to someone else, but there's another element or expectation around alerting the organizational administrator or supervisor of the concerns before making the report. Most of you said no, almost 70%. 31% said yes. Zane?
So I just feel like this goes back to how much we want to dictate to individual institutions on how they handle things. I think we could certainly say that you know, institutions are not prohibited or limited of making internal policies. I'm just not sure that we have to help them dictate those policies. I think our job is to make recommendations to what the law says, right? I think so in other words, if we don't want people delegating their authority, then we say you are not permitted as a mandatory reporter to delegate your authority to a supervisor or anybody else. You as an institution are not allowed to tell an employee that they cannot make their own reports, right? And so if I'm in a school and I'm the school principal and I'm reading the statute and I want to create an internal policy, then my internal policy is, okay, if there's a situation that needs to be reported right away, then my school policy is we're going to have another teacher, counselor, whoever step into the classroom so that teacher can take the 40 minutes to make that report or whatever the case may be. That's what I think as far as procedures, right? I mean, I run an agency and we have a policy. There's nothing in statute that prohibits me right now from making a policy about reporting. And that policy follows the law and then they need to follow up and report it to me. I don't want them to wait. I want them to report. And then I want to know about the report in case there's some kind of fallout or something comes back to my agency. So I think we're I don't want to say we're overthinking things. I really appreciate the discussion and everybody's contribution and what we're saying, because I've changed my perspective on a few things just based on some of the comments. But I still think that our job is just to make recommendations as to what the legislative changes are, and then let the institutions decide how they want to create rules that support what we recommended in the statute.
Thank you. Well, and it sounds like from the conversation that this idea of organizations being able to, so may create policies and procedures for how reports get made, but in such a way cannot limit an individual working for that organization from separately making a report. It sounds like there is an interest in having some flexibility for organizations to establish policies and procedures, but again, that don't absolve or limit an individual's responsibility from or desire to make a report. Stephanie?
Yeah, I'm going to have to run, but I just wanted to hit on what you said, Zane. I think that's accurate, right? When the issue of institutional reporting has crossed our threshold, it was always with the notion of the institution appointing a third party, right, who is unrelated to the incident at all, deciding, one, having a process to decide if a report should be made, and secondly, making the report themselves. So I can see how these things have merged, right? And now I think you're right. We probably don't even need to say institutions can make policies, because at the end of the day, they can make policies. But to your point, based on the law, if we say under no circumstances, right, should employers ever prohibit, quash, right, forbid people from making reports, that covers it. But I just wanted to clarify that it was those two things that were hand in glove that has created this directive and this conversation. So I really appreciate you kind of cutting to the chase and going, we probably don't even need to worry about whether institutions make policies or not, as long as they don't do these things. So I just wanted to provide some context.
Thank you, Stephanie. Have a great day. I know you have to jump. I want to just open the floor if there is like anyone who has any like lingering thought or comment that they want to share before we join the main group.
I just have one last thing. I think the thing that causes the most confusion across all of these questions that we've tried to answer is this shall make a report or cause a report to be made. And I think that the shall cause a report to be made is a loophole that provides not only confusion, but also allows institutions to say, I shall then dictate how a report is made. And so that, to me, that is the language that needs to be addressed, that specific statement.
Thank you, Michelle. Jordan, do you have what you need? Okay, you did a thumbs up. I don't know if I believe you. Thank you all for always such a rich conversation. Looking forward to our next topic, which I don't even remember what it is. But I think we're gonna rejoin the main group. Jordan just popped in the chat the Zoom link to rejoin, so we'll all see you all in just a second as we quantum leap back into the big room.